Part 1. The Shop in the Dust. The dust of Dry Creek, New Mexico territory. Had a taste. It wasn't the honest grit of a plowed field, but the bitter powder of a land baked past remembering the rain. Nora Bellamy tasted it on her tongue as she stepped down from the stagecoach, the flavor of grief and homecoming mixed into one. It was the summer of 1877, and the long drought had left the world in shades of brown and gray, as if God had run out of other colors. Her mother's shop stood just as she'd left it, though it seemed smaller, hunched against the relentless sun. The sign, Bellamy's Laundry and Sundries, was faded, the paint flaking like sunburnt skin. For a moment, Nora just stood there on the boardwalk, her valise in hand, letting the silence of the place settle over her. It was a different silence from the one she'd known before. It had been filled with the rhythmic scrub of her mother's washboard, the gentle clink of jars, the low hum of a hymn. Now, it was an empty, hollow thing. Her mother was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the territory as mercilessly as a prairie fire. Nora had come back not to visit, but to bury, and now, to take up a life she wasn't sure she wanted, in a place she wasn't sure could be saved. Taking a deep breath that was more dust than air, she fitted the iron key into the lock. The door protested with a groan that tore at the quiet street, its bottom hinge hanging loose and wounded. It scraped a sad arc in the floorboards as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale lye soap, dried herbs, and the fine, red dust that seeped through every crack and crevice. A single beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating a million dancing motes. It was a tomb of small things, a testament to a life of quiet labor. Nora set down her bag. She didn't cry. The tears had been spent on the long, jolting journey from Santa Fe. Instead, she unpinned her hat, her fingers moving with a slow, deliberate purpose. She walked behind the counter, her hand trailing over the worn, smooth wood her mother's hands had polished through years of work. There, tucked beneath a tin of coffee, was the ledger. She opened it. The pages were a messy, human map of Dry Creek. Names she knew, names she'd forgotten, names she'd never seen before. Mrs. Gable, for flour and thread. Two Bits, Mr. Henderson from the livery, for tobacco. A nickel. A list of Mexican names: Garcia, Romero, Castillo for candles, beans, and the cheap, sturdy fabric her mother imported. And then there were the names of the Apache women who came down from the hills, trading woven baskets for sugar and salt. Their debts marked not with signatures, but with unique, thumb-printed symbols. The debts were small, but they covered pages. Her mother had run her business on credit and compassion, a dangerous currency in a land this hard. Nora's shoulders slumped. This wasn't a legacy. It was a burden. A ledger full of good intentions that wouldn't pay the freight bill for the next shipment of goods, if she could even afford one. Failure was a cold stone in her gut. She was 25, a seamstress by trade. But she knew more about fine stitches and silk than she did about running a business that seemed to trade mostly in hope. The women of the town were already watching. She knew. A single woman taking over a shop. They'd be whispering behind their hands at the church social, some with pity, others with a sharp, bird-like curiosity, waiting to see her fly or fall. She pushed the ledger aside. First things first, she found her mother's canvas apron hanging on a hook by the back room. It was stiff, stained, and smelled of work. Tying it around her waist, the knot firm at the small of her back, felt like putting on armor. She started to clean, to impose order on the dusty chaos. She swept, dusted shelves, and arranged the sparse remaining inventory into neat, hopeful rows. The work was mindless, repetitive, and it kept the fear at bay. It was mid-afternoon when the broken door finally gave her real trouble. A gust of wind, hot and impatient, slammed it shut with a crack that sent a puff of dust from the rafters. The loose hinge gave way entirely, and the heavy pine door sagged, askew in its frame. It wouldn't open, and it wouldn't fully close. It was a perfect metaphor for her life. She was struggling with it, her shoulder pressed against the wood, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, startled, into a pair of dark, quiet eyes. A man stood there, tall and lean, his face weathered by the sun to the color of worn leather. He wore the simple, dusty clothes of a working man, and he held a heavy blacksmith's hammer in one hand as if it were an extension of his arm. He didn't speak, just tilted his head, assessing the broken hinge with a professional's gaze. "It's busted," Nora said, stating the obvious. She felt a flush of irritation, both at the door and at this silent stranger's sudden appearance. He gave a slow nod. "The pin is sheared, the wood is split." His voice was low, with a soft Spanish accent that rounded the edges of his words. He was Joaquin Reyes, though she didn't know his name then. He was just a presence, a quiet solidity in the shimmering heat. "I can fix it," he said. It wasn't a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. Nora hesitated. Men in Dry Creek didn't often offer help without expecting something more than a thank you. "I can't pay, not until I get the accounts settled." He looked from the door to her, his gaze taking in the smudged apron, the weary set of her shoulders. There was no pity in his eyes, but something that looked like understanding. "I don't want coin," he said. "A pound of coffee, a bar of soap. We can call it even." It was a fair trade, more than fair. She nodded, stepping back to give him room. He set to work immediately, his movements economical and precise. He didn't whistle or hum, but worked in a focused silence broken only by the rhythmic clang of his hammer against metal and the soft rasp of a file. Nora watched him from behind the counter, pretending to sort through a box of buttons. He had the broad shoulders and strong hands of a man who forged iron for a living, but he handled the delicate work on the splintered door frame with a surprising gentleness. He worked for nearly an hour. When he was done, the door hung straight and true on its new, hand-forged pin. It opened and closed with a satisfying, solid click. It was a small thing, a repaired hinge, but it felt like a major victory. The boundary between her small haven and the chaotic world outside was secure once more. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. He simply nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty wrist. She measured out the coffee beans, the scent rich and dark in the stale air, and wrapped a bar of her mother's lye soap in brown paper. She passed the small parcel across the counter. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second. His hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a maker. Hers was pricked and scarred from 1,000 needle points. It wasn't a romantic touch, not in the slightest. It was a brief, silent acknowledgement of shared labor, a recognition of the toll that survival took on the body. He gave her another quiet nod, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of hot metal and the solid, reassuring click of the newly mended door. Nora felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since she'd arrived, a tiny spark of hope. Perhaps she could do this. One repair at a time. One fair trade at a time. The hope was short-lived. Late the next day, 2 riders drew up before the shop, their horses blotting out the afternoon sun. One was Sheriff Whit Dorsey, a man whose gut was growing faster than his authority. The other man sat his horse like a king on a throne, Silas McGraw. Even if you didn't know his name, you knew what he was. His boots were polished, his hat was the finest felt, and his eyes, cold and pale, missed nothing. He was the richest rancher in the county, a man who bought land, men, and justice with equal ease. His shadow was long, and it fell over everything in Dry Creek. "Miss Bellamy," Silas said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that didn't match the harshness of the land. He dismounted with practiced ease, his spurs jingling a sound of casual power. Sheriff Dorsey remained on his horse, looking uncomfortable, his hand resting near his pistol as if by habit. "Mr. McGraw," Nora replied, her hands instinctively gripping the edge of the counter. She would not let him see her fear. "I was sorry to hear about your mother," he said, removing his hat. It was a gesture of respect that felt like a mockery. A fine woman, a pillar of this community. "She was," Nora said, her voice tight. Silas let his gaze roam around the shop, taking in the sparse shelves, the worn floorboards, the single woman standing guard over her meager inheritance. His lips curved into a smile that was all calculation. "It's a hard life for a woman alone, Miss Bellamy. A very hard life. This town, it's changing. The railroad is coming through south of here. Land values are about to skyrocket." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. This was the real reason for his visit. Not condolences, business. "This little plot of yours," he continued, gesturing vaguely with his hat, "is situated quite advantageously, right on the main thoroughfare. I'd be willing to take it off your hands. For a fair price, of course. Enough to set you up comfortably somewhere else. Santa Fe, perhaps. A city is a better place for a woman of your refinement." The offer was an insult wrapped in false courtesy. He saw her not as a business owner, but as an obstacle to be removed. He was offering her money to disappear, to admit she couldn't handle it. The fear in her stomach curdled into a hard knot of anger. This shop, this dusty, debt-ridden, broken-down shop, was all she had left of her mother. It was built of her mother's sweat and bone. "The shop is not for sale. Mr. McGraw," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't tremble. Silas's smile tightened at the edges. "Don't be hasty. My dear, progress is a powerful current. It's better to swim with it than to be swept under." "I'm a strong swimmer," Nora said. For a long moment, there was only silence. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Sheriff Dorsey shifted in his saddle, his eyes fixed on some distant point down the street, wanting to be anywhere else. Silas McGraw put his hat back on, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Nora, and for the first time, the pretense of civility dropped from his eyes, replaced by a cold, possessive glint. He was a man who was not used to being told no. "A pity," he said softly. He turned and swung himself back onto his horse. "You'll reconsider." It wasn't a prediction, it was a promise. He and the sheriff rode away, leaving a cloud of red dust hanging in the air. Nora stood frozen behind the counter, her knuckles white. She looked out the window, past the town and its dusty street, to the horizon. The setting sun was no longer a golden promise. It was a long, angry gash of crimson, bleeding across the sky. The wind picked up, rattling the newly fixed door in its frame, a harbinger of a coming storm, not of water, but of trouble. The dust was rising again, a red wall building in the distance, ready to swallow the light. Part 2. The Cow at the Well. The dawn that followed Silas McGraw's visit broke thin and pale, offering no relief from the oppressive heat that had lingered through the night. Nora had slept in fits, the rancher's veiled threat echoing in the silence of the small back room. She rose before the sun, seeking refuge in the familiar ritual of work. It was in the pre-dawn quiet, as she stepped outside to unlatch the shutters, that the first sign of wrongness reached her. The air, usually just dusty, carried a new, foul scent. It was a thick, coppery smell of decay that caught in the back of her throat. Her eyes followed the scent toward the center of the dusty main street, to the communal well that was the town's lifeblood. A small group of early risers was already gathered there, their forms still indistinct in the gray light, their voices a low, agitated hum. A sense of dread, cold and sharp, pierced the morning warmth. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and walked towards them, her steps quickening. As she drew closer, the scene resolved into a nightmare. Sprawled half in, half out of the well's stone housing was the carcass of a cow. Its body was bloated, its legs stiff and angled towards the unforgiving sky. Its head and shoulders had been wedged down into the opening, fouling the water that lay precious and scarce below. A dark, oily slick shimmered on the surface of the bucket that someone had started to draw before making the discovery. The well, the heart of Dry Creek, had been poisoned. "It's one of McGraw's," a man's voice rasped. "Look at the brand." Nora pushed gently through the small crowd. There, seared into the animal's hide, was the unmistakable Bar S brand of Silas McGraw's vast herds. The implication was immediate and ugly. Panic began to ripple through the onlookers. In a land gripped by drought, water was more valuable than gold. To contaminate the town's only reliable source was an act of profound violence, a threat to every man, woman, and child. "What are we to do?" cried Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of fear. "Our barrels are nearly empty." "It's them Mexicans," another man snarled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "They're always skulking around at night, angry we got this land and they didn't." The accusation hung in the air, finding fertile ground in the town's fear. It was the easy answer, the one that required no thought and stoked old hatreds. Nora felt a surge of revulsion. It was too simple, too convenient. Before anyone could add to the poison, the heavy tread of boots on the boardwalk announced the arrival of the law. Sheriff Dorsey pushed his way through the crowd, his face flushed and his expression annoyed, as if he'd been called away from a pleasant breakfast. He took one look at the dead cow, his nose wrinkling in disgust. "All right, stand back. Give me some room," he ordered, his voice full of manufactured authority. He peered at the brand, McGraw's. Damn. He looked around at the anxious faces, his gaze sweeping over the few Mexican families who stood at the edge of the crowd, their expressions wary and closed. "Just as I figured," the sheriff declared, his voice rising to be heard by all. "It's those drifters, probably trying to steal the cow. Got spooked and shoved it down the well to cover their tracks. I've seen it before." He didn't have a shred of proof, but he spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who found prejudice to be the most useful of tools. A murmur of agreement went through part of the crowd. It was an answer, and in their panic, they would take any answer they could get. Nora opened her mouth to object, to say that it made no sense, but her voice was lost as a new figure moved through the crowd. It was Joaquin Reyes. He moved with the same quiet purpose she'd seen when he fixed her door, his face unreadable. He carried a length of heavy chain and a padlock from his smithy. He didn't look at the sheriff or the crowd. His focus was entirely on the well. "What do you think you're doing?" Reyes Dorsey demanded. Joaquin didn't answer. He expertly looped the chain around the handles of the well's heavy wooden cover and through the crank mechanism, then secured it with the padlock. With a final, decisive click, the well was sealed. He had stopped the immediate danger that someone, in their thirst or stupidity, would try to draw from the contaminated source. "That's town property," the sheriff blustered, his face turning a deeper shade of red. Joaquin finally turned to face him. His eyes were dark and steady. "The water's bad," he said, his voice calm but carrying a clear authority that the sheriff's lacked. "No one drinks until it's clean." He then walked to his nearby smithy and returned with a shovel. Without another word, he began to dig a shallow, sloping trench in the hard-packed earth, leading away from the well toward a low-lying patch of ground. He was preparing for rain, however unlikely, trying to save any drop of clean water that might fall from the sky. His actions, so practical and immediate, stood in stark contrast to the sheriff's empty accusations. A few men, shamed by their own inaction, shuffled forward and took up shovels to help him. The work was hard, the ground like stone, but the rhythmic scrape of metal on earth was a sound of defiance against the morning's chaos. As the men worked, Joaquin paused. Walking back to the cow's carcass, he knelt, his gaze intent on the brand. Nora, drawn by his focus, moved closer. She saw him trace the burned lines of the Bar S with a calloused finger. "What is it?" she asked quietly. He looked up at her, then back at the brand. "When you brand a hide," he said, his voice low, "meant only for her. The burn is clean, the edges are sharp." He pointed to a section of the S. "Here, the hide is scraped, gouged. Someone took a hot iron and tried to change what was already there. This was not a bar S, not originally. This was done by a clumsy hand, a hurried hand." The implication was chilling. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was a carefully staged deception. Someone had taken a cow, altered its brand to look like McGraw's, and then dumped it in the well, all to create a specific narrative of blame. And Nora had a very good idea who stood to benefit from a town gripped by fear and turning on its most vulnerable citizens. Across the street, partially hidden in the shadows of the livery, a young woman watched the scene with wide, frightened eyes. Mabel Finch, a girl of 19 who sometimes did mending for Nora, clutched a small basket of eggs to her chest. She had been on her way to the shop. She hadn't been able to sleep last night, the air being so hot, and had been sitting by her open window. In the dead of night, she had heard the low, muffled sounds of men and a struggling animal near the well. She'd peeked out. In the faint moonlight, she had recognized two of Silas McGraw's ranch hands, men known for their brutish loyalty. She had seen them wrestle something large and dark towards the well. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, seeing the dead cow, hearing the sheriff's words, a cold terror washed over her. She knew the truth, but to speak it, to accuse Silas McGraw's men, that was a fear too great for a girl of 19 to bear. She shrank back into the shadows, her secret a heavy, painful weight in her chest. By midday, the town was a tinderbox of thirst and suspicion. The heat was relentless. People eyed their neighbors' water barrels. The camaraderie of the frontier, always a fragile thing, was beginning to fray. The sheriff made a show of questioning a few young Mexican men, his inquiries laced with threats, before letting them go with a warning. It was a performance for the benefit of the fearful, and it only deepened the divides in the community. Silas McGraw did not make an appearance at the well. He was too clever for that. Instead, he came to Nora's shop in the late afternoon, alone this time. He found her standing by the door, looking out at the town that felt like it was holding its breath. "A terrible business, isn't it?" he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Nora turned to face him, her expression as hard and unyielding as the land around them. "It was murder," she said. "An attempt to murder a town." McGraw gave a theatrical sigh. "Desperate times. It's what happens when there's no strong hand to guide things. People grow fearful. They turn on each other." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I've given it some thought. I have deep wells on my property. Clean water. I could arrange for a water wagon to come into town each day. Sell it, of course. At a reasonable price. I'd be doing the community a service." There it was, the crisis, and now the solution, all provided by the same man. He would make them dependent on him, indebt them to him, and he would do it all under the guise of civic duty. "And what would be the price for me, Mr. McGraw?" Nora asked, her voice cold. His smile was predatory, the same as before. "Sell me this shop. It's clear you're in over your head. This town is no place for a woman trying to make it on her own. I told you you'd reconsider. This is your chance. Take my offer, and you won't have to worry about where your next drink of water is coming from." His threat was no longer veiled. It was a stark choice laid bare in the oppressive heat. Her mother's legacy or her survival. Every instinct screamed at her to accept, to run from this place of dust and quiet malice. But then she thought of her mother's worn ledger, of the trust she had placed in this community, in all its peoples. She thought of Joaquin Reyes, not talking about justice, but creating it with a shovel and a padlock. She thought of the crudely altered brand on the dead cow, a lie so brazen it demanded to be challenged. The truth has no voice if good people stay silent. The thought came to her, clear and strong as a church bell. She looked Silas McGraw directly in the eye. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time, it was outweighed by a burning, righteous anger. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm going to stay, and I'm going to get some clean water." She turned her back on him, a dismissal more powerful than any argument. She walked to the counter, took out a piece of paper, and began to write. Town meeting. Bellamy's Sundries. Sundown. Subject water filtration. Bring buckets. Bring charcoal. Bring sand. Bring hope. She pinned the notice to the outside of her newly repaired door. It was a declaration. She would not be broken. Silas McGraw had meant to poison her town and her resolve. He had succeeded only in making her fight. As she secured the notice, she glanced at the horizon. The red dust was there, as always. But for the first time since her return, she didn't see it as an ending. She saw it as a fire to be forged in. The work would be hard, but they would not die of thirst. Not today. Part 3. A Bridge of Iron and Hands. Nora's handwritten notice on the shop door was a small act of defiance, but in the brittle atmosphere of Dry Creek, it felt like a gunshot. By sundown, a handful of people had gathered inside Bellamy's Sundries, their faces illuminated by the warm, flickering light of a few kerosene lamps. They were not a crowd, but a careful selection of the town's soul. There was Father O'Rourke, the Irish priest, his face a roadmap of worry and conviction. Doña Alma, the town's curandera and midwife, sat with a stillness that seemed to absorb the room's anxiety, her dark eyes missing nothing. A few ranchers who held small plots McGraw coveted, a handful of Mexican families who had borne the brunt of the sheriff's suspicion, and young Mabel Finch, hovering near the back, a silent witness. And in the corner, leaning against a stack of flour sacks, was Joaquin Reyes. He said nothing, his presence a quiet, solid weight in the room. Nora stood behind the counter, her mother's ledger open before her, though she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the faces of her neighbors. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice clearer than she expected. "Mr. McGraw believes we are thirsty enough to sell our freedom for his water. I believe he is mistaken." She laid out her plan. Born from common sense and old knowledge, they would build filters. 3 barrels, one after the other. The first filled with gravel, the second with sand, the third with charcoal from their own hearths. Water poured through the top would come out cleaner at the bottom. It was slow, laborious work, but it was their work. A man grumbled from the back. "That's fine for laundry, Miss Bellamy, but to drink." Before Nora could answer, Doña Alma spoke, her voice soft but carrying an ancient authority. "The greasewood," she said, referring to the tough, resinous creosote bush that dotted the desert. "The leaves, boiled, a small amount in the final barrel. It will kill the sickness in the water. My grandmother taught me. Her grandmother taught her." A silence fell. It was the wisdom of the land itself speaking through the old woman, a knowledge far older than Dry Creek. The men looked at one another, their skepticism warring with a deep-seated respect for the curandera who had delivered half the people in the room. The plan was a stopgap, a way to survive the immediate crisis. The bigger problem remained. The sky was a merciless, empty blue. "We can't rely on the well for now," Nora continued. "But we can prepare for what God provides." She looked toward the roof of her shop. "We need a cistern, a way to catch the rain, if and when it comes." That was when Joaquin finally spoke. "The roof has a good pitch," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He pushed himself off the flour sacks and walked to the center of the room. He wasn't addressing Nora, but the whole group. "You'd need troughs, and a tank. I can build a tank from old lumber. But you need a valve, something strong, made of iron, to control the flow." He looked at Nora then. A direct and steady gaze. "I can forge that." His offer hung in the air. He wasn't just offering a piece of metal. He was offering the heart of the machine. the crucial component that would make it all work. He was committing his strength, his skill, his fire. It was a promise of iron, stronger than any word. The work began the next day. A strange but determined energy took hold of the small group. Under Joaquin's quiet direction, the men began constructing a large wooden cistern behind Nora's shop, while the women and older children gathered sand, gravel, and charcoal for the filtration barrels. Nora's shop became the headquarters of the rebellion, smelling of sawdust, coffee, and a stubborn, earthy hope. Nora found herself working alongside Joaquin, their days falling into a rhythm of shared labor. She would bring him water, a piece of bread at midday. He would show her how to measure a length of lumber, how to hold a tool. They spoke little, but a language passed between them in the silent exchange of a hammer, in the shared glance that acknowledged a well-fitted joint. She learned the landscape of his silence, recognizing its different shades, the deep concentration when he worked, the weary peace at the end of the day, and a darker, more troubled quiet that sometimes fell over him when he looked toward the road leading to McGraw's ranch. She felt the pull of that darkness in him, a past he never spoke of. Rumor in Dry Creek was a currency as common as dust. She'd heard whispers that Joaquin Reyes had once ridden for Silas McGraw, that he'd been one of his best vaqueros before he'd abruptly quit and set up his own smithy. Why had he left? What had he seen? He was a man with a shadow, and Nora, who was fighting so hard to stay in the light, found herself drawn to his complexities. Her own battle raged within her daily, the terror of what Silas might do next versus the fierce, newly discovered strength she felt when she stood her ground. Leaving was safety. Staying was everything else. Meanwhile, Silas McGraw was not idle. He watched the town's cooperative efforts with a cold, calculating fury. Their unity was a direct challenge to his power. If they could provide their own water, they wouldn't need his. He needed to reassert control, not with overt violence this time, but with the more insidious weapon of public opinion. He found his opportunity in the church. Father O'Rourke, a good man with a naive faith in institutions, announced a town fair to be held on the church grounds. The goal was to raise money to hire a professional crew from Santa Fe to properly drain, clean, and repair the communal well. It was a sensible, civic-minded idea, and Silas McGraw saw his opening. He rode into town one afternoon, not with threats, but with a magnanimous smile. He found Father O'Rourke inspecting the church bell rope and made a grand pronouncement, loud enough for all to hear. He, Silas McGraw, would sponsor the fair. He would donate a prize steer for a raffle and provide the lumber for the game booths. And to kick off the fundraising, he presented the stunned priest with a donation of $50 in gold coin, an astronomical sum. "We are all one community. Father," Silas declared, his voice booming with false piety, "we must all do our part in a crisis." He had bought the fair with one gesture. He had transformed himself from a vulture into the town's benefactor. He was no longer the man who had threatened Nora, but the generous rancher trying to save the town his men had poisoned. Those who had been hesitant before now praised his name. He had successfully controlled the narrative. As the day of the fair approached, the sheriff did his part to reinforce the new order, under the pretense of keeping the peace. Dorsey and his deputy began a campaign of petty harassment against the Mexican families. 2 young men, the Romero brothers, were arrested for vagrancy as they walked home from a day of work. They were thrown in jail to await a hearing. The message was clear: there were 2 sets of rules in Dry Creek, one for those who aligned with Silas, and another for everyone else. The arrests sent a chill through Joaquin. Nora saw it in the tightening of his jaw, in the way his hammer fell with a more violent, frustrated force against the anvil in his smithy. He was forging the valve for the cistern, a complex piece of work that required all his focus. The smithy was an inferno of heat and noise, the rhythmic roar of the bellows, the percussive clang of hammer on steel. The hiss of hot metal plunged into water, It was a place of violent transformation. Nora brought him a jar of cool water, her heart aching for the turmoil she knew he felt. He was seeing his own past, his own people, being crushed under McGraw's heel. To act would be to invite that same wrath upon himself, and upon her. To do nothing was to betray his own conscience. He worked late into the night, the glow of his forge painting the darkness in shades of orange and red. Nora found she couldn't sleep. She sat on the back steps of her shop, watching the distant fire, listening to the lonely sound of his hammer. The pain in that sound was palpable, as if he were trying to beat his own demons into shape, to forge his own fractured past into something new and strong, like the valve he was creating. Finally, the hammering stopped. A long silence followed. Then, his silhouette appeared in the doorway of the smithy. He walked slowly toward her, his face streaked with soot, his movements heavy with exhaustion. He held up the finished valve. It was a beautiful piece of work, functional and strong, the metal smooth and dark. "It's done," he said, his voice rough. "It's perfect, Joaquin," she said softly. He looked down at the iron in his hands, then up at her. "Iron can be shaped," he said, his voice low and intense. "You heat it, you beat it, you bend it to your will, but a man's soul, it's not so easy." As he spoke, he swayed slightly. The heat, the labor, the emotional toll of the day had pushed him to his limit. He put a hand out to steady himself against the wall of the cistern, and Nora saw him wince. In the dim light from her kitchen window, she saw a dark, angry burn on his forearm where a piece of flying scale had clearly struck him. "You're hurt," she said, standing up. "It's nothing," he mumbled, trying to pull his arm back. "Don't be a fool," she insisted, her voice gentle but firm. She took his arm, ignoring his protest, and led him into her kitchen. The room was warm, smelling of soap and dried herbs. It was a world away from the fire and violence of the forge. She sat him down in a chair and fetched a bowl of clean water and a strip of soft linen from her sewing basket. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. Her touch was light, practiced. He sat perfectly still, his body rigid, watching her. He was so much bigger than her, his hands so strong, yet he submitted to her care with a childlike vulnerability. The silence in the small room was thick with unspoken things. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the honest scent of sweat, coal, and metal. The work was almost done. The cistern stood ready. The valve was forged. They had built a bridge of iron and wood, but as she dabbed the cool cloth on his skin, her fingers brushing against his, another kind of bridge was being built, one far more fragile and far more terrifying. She finished wrapping the linen around his arm, her hands lingering for a moment. He didn't pull away. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes stripped of their usual guard, showing her the raw exhaustion, the fear, and something else, a deep, aching tenderness that mirrored her own. Outside, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, and then they heard it, a sound so foreign, so longed for, that for a moment it seemed unreal. A single drop of water hitting the tin roof. Then another and another. A slow, hesitant patter, the first rain in months. It was not a storm, not a downpour, just a fragile promise whispered from the sky, a small, precious gift of hope. They stayed there, kneeling and sitting in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sound of life falling on a thirsty land, the world outside holding its breath for what would come next. Part 4. The Wind and the Vile Jest. The church fair dawned under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The few hesitant drops of rain from the night before had done little more than turn the dust to a dark, damp paste that clung to boots and hemlines. It was a humid, breathless day, the air thick with the promise of a heat that had yet to break. Still, a fragile optimism fluttered through Dry Creek. The fair, organized by Father O'Rourke and now bankrolled by Silas McGraw, was a chance to pretend at normalcy, to believe that a few games of chance and a slice of pie could mend the town's fractured spirit. Silas was in his element, moving through the small crowd like a benevolent monarch. He was dressed in a fine black coat, his silver belt buckle gleaming, his laughter booming as he bought raffle tickets for the steer he himself had donated. He was a master of performance, and today he was playing the role of the town's savior. Many were eager to believe it. They laughed at his jokes and thanked him for his generosity, their memories of the poisoned well and the arrested Romero boys conveniently short. Nora had set up a small booth under a canvas awning, selling neat bundles of kindling and jars of the creosote salve Doña Alma had taught her to make. She was there not to celebrate, but to remind them of their purpose. Every coin she earned was for the town, not for McGraw's charity. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity. Her canvas apron, freshly washed and pressed, tied securely around her waist. It felt, as it always did, like armor. Joaquin was there too, but he kept to the edges of the crowd, a silent, watchful presence. He'd helped Nora carry her table over that morning, the two of them working in the comfortable silence that had grown between them. But here, amidst the forced festivity, he seemed coiled and tense. His gaze followed Silas McGraw, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was a thundercloud waiting for a reason to break. And Nora found herself glancing his way often, a silent line of communication passing between them across the bustling churchyard. Mabel Finch drifted through the fair, a small notebook and a stub of a pencil clutched in her hand. She was practicing the letters Nora had begun teaching her, documenting the day in a neat, careful script. Mrs. Gable won the cakewalk. Mr. Henderson is telling stories by the fence. She was an observer, quiet and often overlooked, which allowed her to see and hear things others missed. The afternoon wore on. The heat building, a strange, yellowish light began to filter through the air as the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant, sun-scorched earth. The laughter and chatter of the fairgoers grew strained. Then, without warning, the world seemed to twist. A funnel of wind, a dust devil born of heat and flat land, tore across the churchyard. It was a sudden, chaotic force. It ripped the canvas awning from Nora's booth, sending her jars and bundles scattering. It knocked over a trestle table laden with pies and sent hats cartwheeling through the air. People cried out, shielding their faces from the stinging, swirling grit. The attack was swift and impersonal, an act of a capricious and indifferent nature. Nora had turned to grab hold of her table, her back to the main path. The whirlwind caught the ties of her apron. The knot, which she had tied so carefully that morning, was tugged loose. The wind whipped the apron open, its strings flying free. It was a small, mundane wardrobe failure in the midst of chaos. For a moment, no one noticed, but Silas McGraw, standing not 10 feet away, noticed everything. As the dust devil spun itself out and a shocked calm fell over the crowd, his voice cut through the air. He wasn't yelling, he was laughing, a deep, ugly, knowing laugh that drew every eye. He pointed a manicured finger at Nora as she fumbled with her apron strings, her face flushed with the surprise of the gust. The crowd turned. They saw her, a woman alone, her work apron a symbol of her virtue and industry undone. Silas's smile was a slash of triumph in his handsome face. He let the moment stretch, savoring his audience. Then, loud enough for the entire town to hear, he delivered his poison. The Virgin's apron, untied by the wind, he boomed, his voice thick with malicious glee. He paused, letting the crude implication land. Then he delivered the final, vile blow. Nature wants me to have you too. A profound, horrified silence fell upon the churchyard. The statement was not a physical assault, but it was a violation all the same. It was a public branding, an act of verbal defilement designed to strip her of her dignity and recast her as a loose woman, an object for the taking. He had taken an act of nature and twisted it into a personal, degrading claim. The silence broke, fracturing the community into two distinct halves. A few of Silas's ranch hands and sycophants let out coarse laughs and hoots of approval, their cruelty echoing their masters. But the other half of the town, the women, Father O'Rourke, the decent men froze. Their faces were a mixture of shock, pity, and shame. Their eyes dropped to the ground. They were horrified, but they were also afraid. No one spoke a word in her defense. Their silence was a form of consent. In that terrible, suspended moment, Nora felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare more effectively than any wind. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the apron strings. Then a figure moved. Joaquin. He didn't charge Silas. He didn't draw a weapon. His action was one of profound and quiet grace. He walked directly to Nora's side, his face a mask of cold fury. He shrugged off his own worn denim jacket and, without a word, held it up between her and the gawking crowd. He wasn't covering her body. She was not indecent. He was shielding her from their stares, creating a small, private space for her in the midst of her public degradation. Nora looked up at him, saw the protective fire in his eyes, and found her own strength. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She would not hide. With a steady hand, she pushed his jacket gently aside. She turned her back to the crowd, gathered the linen strings, and retied her apron with a firm, deliberate knot. The simple act was a reclamation. She was putting her armor back on. When she turned back to face Silas McGraw, the tremor was gone from her hands, and the flush of shame had been replaced by the cold, clear light of anger. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the silent yard with the clarity of a bell. "My apron is a symbol of my labor, Mr. McGraw," she said, her eyes locked on his. "My dignity is not tied with a string. It's earned every day when I sweep my floor, when I serve my customers, and when I stand on my own 2 feet on land my mother paid for with her life's work." She took a step forward. "You speak of what nature wants. Nature gave me a spine. It gave me a voice. And it gave me the sense to know the difference between a man and a bully who hides behind his money and his foul mouth." From the edge of the crowd, Mabel Finch, her face pale with shock, scribbled furiously in her little notebook. "He said nature wants me to have you too." She didn't know why, but she knew the exact words had to be written down. They were important. They were a crime. Nora's public rebuke hung in the air, turning the tables on Silas. He was the one who now looked small, his crude jest exposed for the pathetic cruelty it was. The smirks vanished from his men's faces. Father O'Rourke finally found his voice, sputtering, "Mr. McGraw, that was entirely uncalled for." But Silas's shock was already hardening into pure rage. The mask of the town benefactor was gone, burned away by his fury at being publicly defied. He strode toward Nora until he was towering over her, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "You've made your last mistake, girl," he snarled. "All pretense of civility gone. You think your spine is so strong I'll break it. I'll break this whole town. That well sits on public land. And I'll prove in a court of law that my cattle have a greater right to it than any of you. I'll own the water. I'll own this street. And I will own that shop. I'll take it all. And I'll use their laws to do it." He spun on his heel and stalked away, his men scrambling to follow, leaving the fair in a state of utter disarray. The party was over. The flimsy pretense of community had been torn to shreds, just like Nora's awning. People began to drift away, unable to meet Nora's eyes, their shame and fear making them hurry back to the safety of their homes. Soon, only a few remained Father O'Rourke, wringing his hands. Doña Alma, her expression one of grim sorrow, and Joaquin, who had not left her side. He didn't speak. He simply began to help her, picking up the scattered jars of salve, stacking the bundles of kindling. His movements were steady, reassuring. When the last item was packed, he shouldered her heavy box and walked with her back to the shop. They stood on her boardwalk, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows down the empty street. The air was cool now, the heat of the day finally broken. What had happened between them in her kitchen the night before the shared vulnerability? The nascent tenderness seemed a lifetime ago. It was still there, a deep and powerful undercurrent, but it was now buried beneath the hard reality of the coming war. He set the box down by the door. "He won't stop," Joaquin said. It was not a warning. It was a statement of fact. "Neither will I," Nora replied, her voice quiet but unyielding. He looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective light. An unspoken promise passed between them in that gaze. They were in this together. There was no need for declarations of affection, for words of love that would be meaningless in the face of the fight ahead. Their bond had been forged in shared labor, tested by public humiliation, and now sealed in the silent vow of alliance. He gave her a single, solemn nod, and then he was gone, his long shadow merging with the twilight, leaving her alone to guard the door of her shop against the encroaching darkness. Part 5. The Flash Flood. The sky, which had offered a few meager tears, seemed to have spent the next day gathering its rage. The air grew heavy, charged with a strange, metallic scent, and the clouds on the horizon piled up in dark, bruised masses. The heat did not break but was smothered, creating a suffocating, greenhouse-like humidity. By late afternoon, the heavens opened. This was not the gentle, life-giving rain they had prayed for. This was a biblical deluge, a violent assault. The rain fell not in drops but in solid, gray sheets, hammering the tin roofs and turning the dusty street into a thick, churning river of mud. The noise was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out all other sound. The land, baked hard and impenetrable by months of drought, could not drink. The water simply ran, seeking the lowest point, obeying the savage. Simple laws of gravity. Dry Creek had been named for the arroyo that snaked behind the town, a dusty, rock-strewn scar in the earth that was empty 364 days a year. Today was the 365th. A low rumble began to vibrate through the ground, a sound felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Then, a wall of brown water, thick with uprooted sagebrush, rocks, and debris, exploded down the arroyo's channel. It was a liquid battering ram, a terrifying display of nature's pent-up fury. The flash flood had arrived. From the window of her shop, Nora watched in horror as the muddy torrent overflowed the arroyo's banks. It swamped the back lots of the town, sucking at the foundations of sheds and outhouses. She saw one of Mr. Henderson's wagons get lifted and tossed aside like a child's toy. The new cistern they had built, thankfully mostly empty, held firm, a testament to Joaquin's solid construction. The floodwaters surged toward Silas McGraw's property on the edge of town, where he kept a series of holding pens for cattle destined for the railhead. The flimsy fences were torn apart in seconds. A chorus of terrified bellows was cut short as several steers were swept away in the churning water. It was then that Nora saw the horseman. It was Sheriff Dorsey, caught on the wrong side of the arroyo. He had clearly been riding back from McGraw's ranch and had tried to spur his horse across the rapidly swelling wash. It was a fatal miscalculation. The horse lost its footing in the powerful current, screamed, and was pulled under. Dorsey was thrown, his heavy coat instantly waterlogged, and he was dragged into the main, violent channel of the flood. He was a strong man, but he was no match for the water. He was being tumbled, pulled under, his head appearing only for brief, gasping moments. No one could reach him. To enter that water was suicide. Suddenly, the door to the smithy was thrown open. Joaquin emerged, a heavy coil of rope over his shoulder. He didn't hesitate. His eyes, practiced and quick, assessed the flood's current, the position of a sturdy cottonwood tree on the bank. and Dorsey's trajectory. He moved with a speed and certainty that was breathtaking. He secured one end of the rope to the tree's thick trunk, knotted a loop in the other, and ran along the bank, keeping pace with the flailing sheriff. "Dorsey," he roared, his voice cutting through the storm. "Grab it!" He threw the rope with all his strength. It uncoiled perfectly, the loop landing just a few feet from the sheriff. Dorsey's hand, clumsy and desperate, missed it on the first pass. He was being swept past the tree. It was now or never. With a final, desperate lunge, his fingers closed around the rope. The current nearly tore his arm from its socket, but he held on. Now came the true test. Joaquin dug his heels into the slick mud, his muscles straining as he took the full weight of a grown man being pulled by a raging flood. He was an anchor against the chaos. Slowly, hand over agonizing hand, he began to haul the rope in, pulling the sheriff out of the main current and toward the relative safety of the bank. Other men, seeing his efforts, rushed to help, grabbing the rope behind him, adding their weight to the struggle. They dragged the sputtering, half-drowned Sheriff Dorsey onto the muddy bank like a landed fish. He lay there for a long moment, coughing up muddy water, his face pale with shock and proximity to death. His eyes, when he finally opened them, found Joaquin, who stood over him, breathing heavily, the rope still in his hands. He, the man Dorsey had harassed and publicly suspected, had just saved his life. The sheriff said nothing, but a look of profound, bewildered conflict passed over his face. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A watery, late-afternoon sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a scene of devastation. The world was coated in a thick, brown layer of mud. The floodwaters in the arroyo began to recede quickly, leaving behind a tangled mess of debris. The townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces grim, to survey the damage. Their first concern was the well. They gathered around it in a somber crowd. It was a disaster. The flood had breached the stone housing, and the well was now completely choked with mud, silt, and filthy runoff from McGraw's ruined cattle pens. It was more poisoned now than it had been with the dead cow. It would take weeks, perhaps months, of backbreaking labor to clean. As they stood there in despair, a boy's voice piped up. "Look at that!" He was pointing at the ground near the well. Ground that had been scoured clean by the floodwaters. The topsoil had been stripped away, and something was visible that had not been there before. A series of wooden posts, driven deep into the earth. They were new. The raw, splintered tops a stark contrast to the old, weathered fence lines of the town. They ran in a perfectly straight line, not along the established property boundaries, but cutting across the common land, enclosing the well within a new, unseen perimeter, a perimeter that belonged, everyone knew, to Silas McGraw. The flood, in its destructive fury, had performed an act of profound revelation. It had washed away the dirt and lies and exposed the physical evidence of Silas's crime. He hadn't been waiting for the law. He had been secretly remaking it in the dead of night, one fence post at a time. A cold, hard silence fell over the crowd as they understood what they were seeing. This was the proof. This was the truth, laid bare by the indifferent hand of nature. Nora looked from the posts to Joaquin, who was still standing near the shaken sheriff. A few of McGraw's sympathizers, seeking to deflect the damning evidence, began to mutter. "Quite a show," one of them said, loud enough for others to hear. "Reyes just happens to be there with a rope to save the sheriff. How convenient." The insinuation was ugly that this had all been some elaborate scheme, but before the poison could spread, Sheriff Dorsey staggered to his feet. He was covered in mud, his authority washed away, leaving only a man who had stared into the abyss. "Shut your mouth. Cletus!" he rasped, his voice raw. "That man just kept you from having to elect a new sheriff." He looked at Joaquin, and for the first time, There was something other than suspicion in his eyes. It was a grudging, complicated respect. A debt had been incurred, and Whit Dorsey, for all his flaws, was a man who understood the weight of a debt. That evening, the lamps in Nora's shop burned late once more. This time, the mood was not one of desperate defense, but of focused, angry purpose. Nora, Father O'Rourke, and Doña Alma sat around the main counter. The exposed fence posts had changed everything. They had moved from being victims to being litigants. "He will have papers," Father O'Rourke said, his brow furrowed. "Forged deeds, a paid surveyor. The judge at the county seat is known to be friendly to men with deep pockets." "Then we must be better prepared," Nora said, her voice firm. She looked at the two of them, her allies. "We need more than just those posts. We need words. We need witnesses to his character, to his pattern of threats and intimidation." And so, the new work began. Not with shovels and hammers, but with quiet conversations and the careful gathering of truths. The next day, Nora sought out Mabel Finch. She found the young woman helping her mother sweep mud from their porch. Nora spoke to her gently, not as a lawyer, but as a teacher and a friend. She asked Mabel to write down exactly what she had seen at the fair and what she had heard. Trembling, but resolute, Mabel went inside and returned with her notebook, its pages filled with her neat, clear script, a chronicle of a crime that had no physical evidence but was a deep wound on the town's soul. Father O'Rourke, meanwhile, used his connections. He spoke to the foreman of the Irish crew laying track for the railroad. These were hard men who had no love for arrogant ranchers who treated them like dirt. They recounted stories of McGraw's men trying to scare them off sections of land the railroad had legally acquired, of threats made in the dead of night. Doña Alma, in her quiet way, was perhaps the most effective of all. She moved through the Mexican community, speaking to the miners and their families in their own language. She listened to their stories of stolen wages, of being pushed off small claims, of the constant, grinding fear of McGraw's power. She gathered not signed affidavits, but oral histories, promises from men and women who had been silent for too long that they would speak, if only someone would listen. Nora took all of it, Mabel's careful notes, the foreman's angry testimony, Doña Alma's collection of grievances, and compiled it into a single, damning dossier. Each page was a nail in the coffin of Silas McGraw's reputation. A week after the flood, she stood on the boardwalk, a heavy satchel in her hand containing all their work. The stagecoach to the county seat was due any minute. She was no longer just a shopkeeper defending her mother's legacy. She was an accuser. She was taking the fight to him, using the very tool he had threatened to use against her, the law. She had shifted from defense to offense. The fear was still there, a cold companion in her gut. But now it was overshadowed by a powerful, unyielding resolve. The flood had washed the world clean, and in its wake, she could see the path forward. It was a hard path, a dangerous path, but for the first time, it was a path of her own choosing. Part 6. The Night of Fire and the Tolling Bell. The days following Nora's trip to the county seat were heavy with a silence that felt louder than any noise. Dry Creek held its breath. Everyone knew a complaint had been filed. Everyone knew Silas McGraw had been legally challenged. An act as audacious as trying to lasso the moon. They were waiting for the Titan to stir, and no one knew what form his anger would take. The nights were the worst, filled with unfamiliar shadows and the sound of the wind whispering threats through the eaves. Nora found herself sleeping lightly, her mother's old shotgun loaded and leaning against the wall by her bed. Joaquin worked late at his forge each night, the rhythmic, reassuring clang of his hammer a lonely beacon in the darkness. He was not working on any particular commission. He was simply awake, watchful, his fire a sentinel in the tents, waiting town. The retaliation came on a moonless night. 3 days after the papers from the county clerk had officially been served to Silas McGraw, Nora was jolted from a shallow, uneasy sleep not by a sound, but by a smell acrid and sharp, the smell of burning pine. Then came the sound, a hungry crackle from the back of the shop, where her storeroom was. A strange, flickering orange light danced beneath her bedroom door. Fear, cold and absolute, seized her for a heartbeat. Then, adrenaline surged through her, hot and clean. She grabbed the shotgun, her hands steady, and ran through the main shop. Peering through the front window, she saw it. Flames were already licking up the outer wall of the storeroom, greedily consuming the dry, aged wood. Before she could even scream, a new sound split the night, a sound that was both terrifying and beautiful. A frantic, clanging peal from the church bell. Bong, 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 bong. It was not the steady, solemn toll for Sunday service, but a desperate, urgent alarm, a cry for help cast in iron and sent out into the sleeping darkness. Joaquin, who had been watching the shadows from his smithy, had seen the first flicker of light. He hadn't run for a bucket. He had run for the bell. He knew this was a fight no single person could win. He reached the church just as a startled Father O'Rourke, awakened by the commotion, came running out. Together, they heaved on the thick rope, sending the bell's desperate plea echoing across the territory. One by one, lights began to appear in the windows of Dry Creek. Doors were thrown open. People emerged, their faces etched with sleep and fear. The cry went up fire, fire at Bellamy's, and the fear in their eyes was quickly replaced by a shared, grim purpose. For weeks they had been a town divided by suspicion and fear. But the sight of the flames devouring Nora's shop, the one place that had become a symbol of their defiance, and the relentless, urgent tolling of the bell, forged them into something new. They were a community again. Men and women ran with buckets, axes, anything they could carry. A human chain formed, a bucket brigade stretching from the nearest horse trough to the fire. Anglo ranchers stood shoulder to shoulder with Mexican laborers, their shared goal erasing the lines of prejudice that had been drawn so carefully between them. Sheriff Dorsey, roused by the bell, arrived not as Silas's man, but as the town's lawman, barking orders, organizing the chaos into an effective, desperate assault against the flames. From her bedroom window overlooking the alley behind the shop, Mabel Finch watched, her heart pounding. The bell had woken her, the orange glow filling her room. In the chaotic, dancing light of the fire, she saw them. 3 figures, scrambling away down the dark alley, their faces illuminated for a fleeting second. 2 were McGraw's ranch hands, men she recognized instantly. The third was a younger man, thin and wiry, with Silas's arrogant profile but none of his confidence. It was Silas's estranged son, a bitter, resentful youth named Caleb who lived in his father's shadow. They were the arsonists. Mabel shrank back from the window, her mind a camera, capturing the image, the names, the certainty of their guilt. The fire raged. The heat was immense, the smoke thick and choking. Nora worked alongside the others, her face smudged with soot, her lungs burning. She refused to be a victim waiting to be rescued. It was her shop, her life, and she would fight for it. She saw Joaquin, a towering figure of fury and strength, hacking at the storeroom roof with an axe to vent the flames, his muscles straining in the firelight. She saw Doña Alma directing women to soak blankets in water to protect the main building. She saw a town that had refused to die. And then he arrived. Silas McGraw rode into the light of the fire, 2 of his most loyal men behind him. He looked like a demon conjured from the flames, his face a mask of triumphant fury. He had expected to find a ruin, to see Nora weeping in the street, to watch a town paralyzed by his power. Instead, he saw a disciplined, unified army of his own neighbors working to undo his crime. He saw his power not confirmed, but defied. He saw that he had lost. The sight broke something inside him. All calculation, all pretense of control, shattered. There was only pure, animalistic rage. He spurred his horse through the crowd, straight toward Nora. "This is what happens when you defy me," he roared, his voice cracking with madness. "I'll burn it all to the ground." He leaped from his horse, and his hand went to the pistol at his hip. He drew the gun, its polished steel gleaming in the firelight, and leveled it at Nora. Time seemed to slow. The roar of the fire, the shouting of the bucket brigade. It all faded into a dull hum.
"That's enough. Silas!"
Sheriff Dorsey stepped between them. He didn't draw his own weapon. He simply stood there, a wall of mud-stained, exhausted flesh, his face grim. He had made his choice. The debt from the flood was being paid. It's over. "Get out of my way, wit!" Silas snarled, his eyes wild. From the other side, Joaquin moved forward. He held the fire axe in his hands, its heavy head dripping with the water. He was coiled, ready to spring, a killing rage in his eyes. For a moment, it seemed the night would erupt into a bloodbath. Nora's own hand, as if by instinct, found the grip of the shotgun she had left leaning by the shop door. The cold, smooth wood felt like a righteous extension of her own fury. The urge to raise it, to aim, to pull the trigger and erase this monster from the world was overwhelming. But then she looked at Joaquin. She saw the raw violence in him, a violence she knew he hated, and she saw him master it, with a visible, shuddering effort of will. He lowered the axe until its head rested on the ground. It was a surrender not to Silas, but to a principle. He would protect, but he would not become a killer. He was choosing life over victory. His choice became her choice. She saw the faces in the crowd, her neighbors, who had risked their own lives for her. She saw the bucket brigade, their movements a testament to hope, not hatred. Vengeance would burn down everything they had just saved. Justice had to be built, slowly and deliberately, like a stone wall. Her fingers loosened on the shotgun. She let it be. She had chosen the law, and she would not abandon it now for the simple, bloody satisfaction of revenge. Silas, seeing he was now facing not just 3 people but an entire town, hesitated. The tolling of the church bell, which had never stopped, was a maddening, relentless judgment. The crowd was closing in, their faces hard and accusing in the firelight. He could shoot Nora, but he couldn't shoot all of them. His public performance had failed. His private violence had been thwarted. He was exposed, alone, and for the first time in his life, powerless. With a final, frustrated scream of pure rage, he shoved past the sheriff and scrambled back onto his horse. "You'll all pay for this," he shrieked, a hollow, meaningless threat. He dug his spurs into the horse's flanks and fled, his 2 men close behind, galloping away from the fire and the town that had finally, irrevocably, turned against him. They disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of fading hoofbeats. In the sudden, stunned silence that followed, a new sound emerged. A group of men, including the Romero brothers whom Dorsey had released that morning, were marching up the alley. They had 3 men held firmly in their grasp, the 2 ranch hands, and a terrified Caleb McGraw, all of them reeking of kerosene. Mabel Finch had found her voice and told the men what she'd seen. Sheriff Dorsey, looking at the captured arsonists, then at the embers of the fire, and finally at Nora and Joaquin, seemed to stand a little taller. He walked over to the captives, his movements weary but deliberate, and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The fight was over. The arrests were made. Silas McGraw was a fugitive. The fire was finally extinguished as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Nora's storeroom was a blackened, smoldering shell. But the shop, her home, had been saved. She stood before the ruin, surrounded by her neighbors, her people, all of them exhausted, filthy, and bound together by the shared ordeal of the night. The bell had fallen silent. A new day was beginning, born from a night of fire in a community that had refused to burn. Part 7. The Dust Red Trial. The county courthouse was a squat adobe building that baked in the relentless New Mexico sun, radiating heat like a kiln. Inside, the air was even hotter, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and the fine, red dust that coated every surface. The room was packed to overflowing. Nearly every soul from Dry Creek who could make the journey was there, their Sunday clothes looking stiff and out of place, their faces a mixture of fear, grim resolve, and a kind of hungry anticipation. They had come to see justice, or some version of it, meted out. Nora sat on a hard wooden bench at the front, Father O'Rourke on one side, Doña Alma on the other. Joaquin sat directly behind her, a silent, solid presence at her back. He did not look at the defendants, but Nora could feel the tension radiating from him, a stillness so profound it was like the compressed energy before a lightning strike. Across the aisle sat the accused, the two surly ranch hands, and Silas McGraw's son, Caleb, looking pale and shrunken without his father's shadow to hide in. Beside them sat their lawyer, a man named Sterling from Santa Fe. He was the physical opposite of the land around them, sleek, polished, and tailored, his smile as artificial as a glass eye. He was a creature of paper and ink, a mercenary of the law hired to obscure the truth, not reveal it. The circuit judge, a man named Hargrove with a weary face and eyes that had seen too much human folly, banged his gavel. The trial began. The charges were red arson, destruction of property, conspiracy. Intertwined with the criminal case was Nora's civil petition, a challenge to the illegal fencing of the public land around the well. It was all one big messy tangle of greed and violence, and Judge Hargrove looked as if he'd rather be anywhere else. The county prosecutor, a young, earnest man, started with the tangible. He unrolled a surveyor's map, its lines crisp and clear. He demonstrated with methodical precision how the new fence posts, the ones unearthed by the flood, deviated from the established property lines recorded in the territorial registry. The posts were a physical, irrefutable lie, driven deep into the earth. Mr. Sterling, the defense lawyer, objected on technicalities, but the evidence was plain. The land had been stolen, or at least an attempt had been made. Then the prosecutor called his first key witness. The court called Sheriff Whit Dorsey. A murmur went through the crowd as Dorsey took the stand. He looked different. The night of the fire had burned away his lazy complacency, and the flood had washed away his fear. He recounted the events of that night with a quiet, factual authority. The alarm, the fire, the community's response, and the capture of the 3 men reeking of kerosene. Then the prosecutor asked, "Sheriff, you've known the defendant, Mr. Caleb McGraw, and his father for a long time. What can you tell us about their character?" Sterling was on his feet. Objection, hearsay, speculation. Sustained. The judge sighed. "Stick to the facts, counselor." The prosecutor nodded. "Sheriff, let's talk about the flash flood. Is it true that you found yourself in some difficulty that day?" Dorsey's eyes flickered for a moment toward Joaquin. "I made a foolish choice," he said, his voice low but clear. "My horse was swept away. The flood had me. I was drowning." He paused, and every person in the courtroom leaned forward. "Joaquin Reyes saved my life. He pulled me from that water at great risk to himself. Without him, I'd be dead." The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. It destroyed the narrative Sterling had hoped to build that Joaquin was a dangerous outsider, a violent Mexican agitator. In the eyes of the law, he was now a hero, vouched for by the sheriff himself. Joaquin didn't react, his face remaining a stoic mask, but Nora felt the tension in his shoulders ease almost imperceptibly. The next witness was Mabel Finch. She walked to the stand, clutching her small, cloth-bound notebook as if it were a holy book. She was pale, her hands trembling. But as she was sworn in, her eyes met Nora's for a second, and a spark of courage passed between them. The prosecutor handled her gently. "Miss Finch, please tell the court what you observed on the day of the church fair." Mabel opened her notebook. Her voice was barely a whisper at first. "There was a wind, a dust devil. It came through and it untied Miss Bellamy's apron." Sterling smirked, as if this were all childish nonsense. "And what happened then?" Miss Finch, the prosecutor, prompted. Mabel took a deep breath. She looked down at her own handwriting, the words she had so carefully recorded. Her voice grew stronger, clearer, fueled by the memory of the injustice. "Mr. Silas McGraw." He laughed. He laughed at her. And then he said, she looked up, directly at the judge. He said, "The Virgin's apron, untied by the wind, nature wants me to have you too." She said the words exactly as Silas had, her voice ringing with a conviction that left no room for doubt. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. To hear the vile jest repeated in this formal, solemn place was to understand its true ugliness. It was an assault, a public degradation, and it painted a perfect picture of Silas McGraw's character, a man who saw others not as people, but as things to be used and discarded. It was the motive for everything that followed. It was the reason for the fire. Sterling did his best to discredit her on cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are a student of the complainant, Miss Bellamy. Are you not a friend? Perhaps she asked you to remember things a certain way." "I wrote it down as he said it," Mabel replied, her voice shaking but firm. "I write down the truth." She held up her notebook. The small, simple object seemed more powerful than all of Sterling's legal bluster. Finally, Nora was called to the stand. She walked with her head held high, her simple dress clean and pressed, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She answered the prosecutor's questions clearly and concisely, recounting McGraw's initial offer to buy her shop, his threats, and the events of the fire. Then it was Sterling's turn. He approached the witness stand like a wolf circling its prey. His strategy was clear. He couldn't disprove the fire, and he couldn't erase the fence posts, so he would attack the victim. "Miss Bellamy," he began, his voice oozing a false sincerity. "You are a young, unmarried woman who chose to take over a business in a rough town, a town full of men. Was that a wise decision?" "It was my mother's business," Nora replied evenly. "It was my right." "You're right, of course," Sterling purred. "But you must admit, it's an unusual position, and you've formed a rather close association with Mr. Joaquin Reyes. Have you not a man of a certain reputation, a blacksmith who seems to be at the center of every conflict in town?" "Mr. Reyes has been a good neighbor and a good friend," Nora said, her voice like ice. Sterling leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. "A friend? Miss Bellamy, let's be frank. Isn't it true that you are a woman who knows how to use her situation to her advantage? A single woman, running a shop, garnering sympathy, attracting the attention of men like Mr. Reyes and even the sheriff. Aren't you, in fact, an opportunist who has provoked this entire unfortunate series of events for your own gain?" The accusation was a vile poison, an attempt to twist her strength into a flaw, her independence into an invitation. It was the same public stripping of dignity Silas had attempted at the fair, but this time it was cloaked in the language of the law. Nora felt a surge of white-hot rage, but before she could speak, a voice boomed from the gallery. "Objection." It was Father O'Rourke. He was on his feet, his face flushed with righteous anger, his fist clenched. "I object to this line of questioning. It is an abhorrent slander against a woman of unimpeachable character." Judge Hargrove banged his gavel. "Father O'Rourke, you are out of order. Sit down." But the priest did not sit down. And then another figure rose, Mrs. Gable, her face set like stone. Then another woman, and another, all across the courtroom. The women of Dry Creek, the ones who had gossiped, the ones who had watched in silent fear, were getting to their feet. They did not speak. They did not shout. They simply stood, a silent, unshakable wall of solidarity. They were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses. The judge stared, bewildered, at the standing women. Sterling's smirk faltered. His attack had backfired. He had not isolated Nora. He had shown the whole town that the attack on her was an attack on all of them. The final witness the prosecutor called was Doña Alma. She walked to the stand with a quiet dignity that commanded the room. She carried no notes, only the weight of her years and her wisdom. Doña Alma, the prosecutor said respectfully, you were present the night of the fire, were you not? I was, she said, her voice clear. And did you render aid to the injured? I did. She held up a small, worn, leather-bound book. This is my ledger. In it, I have the names of 17 people I treated that night for burns, for smoke in their lungs, for cuts and bruises. Mr. Henderson, whose arm was burned by a falling beam. The Romero boys, who breathed too much smoke. Mrs. Gable's son, who cut his hands on broken glass. She looked from the judge to the jury box. These people were not fighting for a promiscuous woman or an opportunist. They were fighting for their neighbor. They were fighting for their town. They were fighting for the home that Nora Bellamy, like her mother before her, has made for all of us. Her testimony was the final, devastating blow. She had not only defended Nora's character, she had held up a mirror to the community, showing them the courage and unity they had forged in the fire. There was little left for Sterling to say. His closing argument was weak, full of legal jargon that could not obscure the simple, powerful truth the jury had heard. When the jury filed out, no one in the courtroom moved. They waited. It did not take long. When the jury returned, their foreman, a grim-faced rancher, refused to look at the defendants. The verdict was read, guilty, on all counts. Judge Hargrove delivered the sentence. The two ranch hands received 20 years of hard labor. For Caleb McGraw, whose youth and paternal pressure were taken into account, it was 10. The judge declared the new fence line illegal and ordered that the land around the well be held in public trust for the citizens of Dry Creek forever. And finally, he issued an official, territorial-wide warrant for the arrest of Silas McGraw for arson, conspiracy, and attempted murder. A wave of cathartic relief washed through the courtroom. It was over. As the crowd filed out into the blinding afternoon sun, Nora stood on the courthouse steps, blinking. The people of Dry Creek gathered around her, not to stare, but to offer a handshake, a nod, a quiet word of thanks. She looked at their faces, the ones who had stood for her, the ones who had found their voices, and her heart filled with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for standing with me." Joaquin came to her side, his presence a warm, solid comfort. He did not touch her, but his shoulder was close enough for her to feel his warmth. Together, they looked down the dusty road that led back home. The war for Dry Creek's soul was over. They had won. Part saint, fresh water, iron roads, and a home. The autumn that followed the trial was a season of mending. The work began, as all things in Dry Creek did, at the well. It was a monumental task. The shaft was choked with a foul-smelling sludge of mud and cattle filth. But the labor was not grim. It was a ritual of purification, a communal act of reclaiming their town's heart. Under Joaquin's direction, they built a sturdy tripod derrick over the well's opening. He forged new, stronger hooks and pulleys, his hammer ringing with a clean, purposeful sound that echoed through the town. The men took turns being lowered into the darkness, sending up bucket after bucket of mud. Above, the women and older children carted the sludge away, their movements a synchronized dance of recovery. Nora was at the center of it all, organizing the shifts, providing water from their rain cistern, and serving hot coffee and stew from a makeshift kitchen outside her shop. She and Joaquin worked as one, a partnership forged in fire and now tempered in the steady work of rebuilding. There were no grand declarations, only the quiet, profound language of shared labor. A glance across the dusty work site, a shared cup of water at midday, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a tool. These were the bricks and mortar of their love. When the last of the muck was cleared, and fresh, sweet water began to seep back into the well from the deep aquifers, a cheer went up that seemed to shake the dust from the sky. They did not just cap the well, they celebrated it. Joaquin forged a new, ornate iron crank handle, its design incorporating the desert marigold. The men built a new, higher stone wall around it, and on a smooth, flat stone, Father O'Rourke chiseled a single word: Unitas, unity. With the water flowing clean and the storeroom rebuilt stronger than before. With thicker walls and a fire-resistant sod roof, a new kind of life began to settle over Dry Creek. Nora, looking at the faces of the children who played in the street, saw another kind of thirst that needed quenching. One afternoon, she cleared the main table in her shop, swept the floor meticulously, and set up 3 large pieces of slate against the far wall. She brought out chalk and a handful of primers she had ordered from Santa Fe. When Mabel Finch came in for thread, Nora handed her a piece of chalk. "School starts at 3 o'clock, she said with a smile. "I'll need an assistant teacher." Mabel's eyes widened, first in shock, then with a brilliant, shining pride. And so, Bellamy's Sundries became the Dry Creek schoolhouse each afternoon. The first day, only 5 children came. By the end of the week, there were 12. The sons and daughters of Anglo ranchers sat beside the children of Mexican miners. 2 quiet, curious Apache children, whose mother traded with Nora, began to appear at the edge of the group, until one day Nora gently invited them to take a seat. And they did. Nora taught them their letters. Mabel taught them their numbers. And together they created a small, radical space where the divisions of the outside world did not exist. The scratching of chalk on slate became the town's new favorite song. One cool evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Joaquin found Nora on the front porch of the shop, watching the last of her students head home. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood beside her, leaning against the post. "Nora Bellamy," he said at last, his voice quiet and serious. He turned to face her. "I am not a man of many words. My promises are made of iron. I want to build a life with you." Nora's heart, which she had thought could hold no more emotion after the turmoil of the past months, swelled with a deep, quiet joy. "I want that too." "Joaquin Reyes," she whispered. They were married twice. The first time was on a Sunday, in the small adobe church. Father O'Rourke blessed their union before the entire town, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of the love that had been forged in adversity. Nora wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, and Joaquin stood tall and proud in a clean shirt. The second time was that evening, a ceremony as old as the land itself. Doña Alma gathered them, along with a few close friends, behind the shop as the stars began to appear. She lit a bundle of dried sage, its fragrant smoke cleansing the air. She spoke in Spanish, her words a soft, melodic blessing for a strong home, healthy children, and a love that would endure like the desert mountains. They shared a piece of cornbread and drank water from the same cup, a simple, profound ritual of unity. Their life together would be a bridge, like them, between 2 worlds. Their intimacy was a quiet, private language. It was in the way his large, calloused hand would find hers as they sat on the porch in the cool of the night, their fingers lacing together. It was in the shared glance across a crowded room that said more than words ever could. It was in the peace of falling asleep to the sound of his steady breathing, a bulwark against the darkness and the ghosts of the past. Theirs was a love built not on fleeting passion, but on the unshakable foundation of respect, partnership, and shared survival. That winter, A new sound came to the territory, a lonely, mournful whistle that echoed across the plains, followed by the rhythmic, earth-shaking chuff-chuff-chuff of a steam engine. The railroad had arrived. The progress Silas had used as a threat was now a reality. A pair of iron rails gleaming in the sun a few miles south of town. For a week, the town was apprehensive. They had fought so hard for their small piece of the world. Would this iron monster now devour it? But Nora, ever practical, saw not a threat, but an opportunity. "Those engines run on water," she said at a town meeting, "and we have the sweetest, cleanest water in the territory." When the first train slowed to take on water from the new tower the railroad company had built, the people of Dry Creek were there to meet it. They came with wagons loaded with barrels of fresh well water, with baskets of bread and dried meat, with crates of mended clothes and resoled boots. The passengers, weary and dusty from their journey, bought everything they had. Dry Creek was no longer a forgotten outpost on the edge of nowhere. It was a vital stop, a place of rest and supply. They had taken the instrument of their potential destruction and turned it into their lifeline. The news about Silas McGraw came with the railroad. A Texas Ranger, passing through on the train, stopped in Nora's shop for tobacco and recognized the name of the town from the wanted poster in his pocket. McGraw the Ranger said, leaning against the counter, "Oh, we got him. Found him in a dusty cantina near the border. Funny thing was, it was his own men who turned him in. Seems he ran out of money to pay them, and their loyalty was only as deep as his pockets. They sold him out for $100 and a bottle of whiskey." He shook his head. The kind of evil that man was built on. It always eats itself in the end. The news spread through the town not with loud celebration, but with a quiet, somber relief. The shadow was finally, truly gone. The evil had consumed itself. That night, Nora sat on the porch, darning one of Joaquin's shirts. She wore a new apron, one she had sewn from a soft, dark blue calico. It was not the stiff, stained armor of her first days back. It was the simple garment of a woman who was free, a worker, a wife, a teacher, a woman who was whole. Joaquin came and sat beside her, laying his hand gently on the new wood of the porch railing she had helped him install. The sounds of the evening were peaceful, a coyote's distant call, the soft murmur of conversations from neighboring houses, the gentle clink of glasses from the saloon. In the distance, the train's whistle blew, a lonely but hopeful sound that no longer spoke of threats, but of connection, of a future rolling down the tracks. He looked at her, at the lamplight glowing on her hair, at the peaceful, determined set of her jaw. He looked at the town they had fought for, the community they had helped mend. He looked at the well, standing proud in the starlight, its fresh, sweet water flowing deep in the earth. The long drought was over, in the land and in their hearts. This was home. Thank you for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Night, like this video, and give it an extra boost by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.